This is not a video about Bryan Lunduke, the well-known speaker in the Linux community. This is something inspired by Bryan Lunduke. In one of his presentations, he laments that websites currently are much worse than they used to be. They're very large and very slow, and they consume much more memory than they need to. Now, everything he says about lazy loading and displaying items through dynamic loading, that's all pretty sound. Everybody kind of hates that stuff. But what he says about web pages being larger, that's not entirely true. But I decided I would check out his website and see what he has going on and see what he's doing. And he's definitely taken a minimalist approach. The problem is that he's also doing things in a very old style. So I decided that this would be a very good example page to renovate, to take his page, and without commenting on the aesthetics or the design, without changing the look and the feel too drastically or adding a bunch of code, I would bring it into a more modern style. So what I did here, starting right off the bat, was to create a style sheet. The style sheet is going to decide what everything looks like on the page. The next thing was to add the language tag to the body. This is important for screen readers. Anyone who comes to the site using a screen reader application for accessibility purposes should have the language defined so that the screen reader knows how to pronounce certain things. I took the hyphen and equal sign out of the title of the page because that isn't really something you want read aloud to somebody visiting the site, and decided to display that as content in the before and after pseudo elements in CSS. The next thing we need to do is address how he creates rows and columns. Tables used to be fine a very long time ago, and browsers will still kind of handle it, but there are big limitations to tables. One of the things that made me consider revamping this page specifically was that Bryan Lunduke's concerns hinged a little bit on memory consumption and CPU consumption. And one of the worst things you can do for CPU consumption from an HTML standpoint is to put your content in a table. The table, because all of the elements depend on all of the other elements to get their sizes, takes a long time for the browser to render because it goes back and forth between the different elements trying to decide what the ultimate widths of each column should be. Even if you set them manually, the browser's still going to have to check to make sure that the contents don't push the width of the table wider than the size that you set. So ideally what you'd like to do is to create rows and columns using non-semantic HTML. Now, there's an important difference to make here between semantic markup and non-semantic markup. Semantic HTML are any HTML tags that have meaning, that represent a thing. A paragraph is a thing that exists in the real world. The P tag in HTML represents a paragraph. A heading that describes the content below it is a real thing in a book, so the H1 and H2 tags, they represent a heading in a book. The div tag in HTML does not have any sort of equivalent. So it's important that we use non-semantic HTML for pure layout and use semantic HTML to describe things that have real-world analogs. In this case, I just turned a bunch of lines that had hyphens at the beginning into an unordered list. It's important to do so because, first of all, browsers understand it as a list. A web crawler, such as Google, any sort of search engine, will understand it as a list. And your screen readers will understand it as a list. So this list, when encountered by NVDA, will read it as list with 3 items. First item, and then start reading the first item. This allows people who use keyboard navigation or who use screen readers to quickly navigate forward and backward through a logical list of items with a defined beginning and end. It helps them out a lot. You should never skip out on it. You should never fake a list when you can create one for real. This little section here is going to get a little repetitive. I'm just copying content from the table columns and putting them into the non-semantic columns, and then formatting the HTML so that text is either in a paragraph or it's in a list, or that's pretty much what we have here for elements. This is a pretty simple page. Here I just change a div to a paragraph. There's not a huge benefit, but I like to have things in paragraphs when possible. One thing that Bryan Lunduke railed against is items that cause the page to change position after load, and everyone hates that. It's the worst. You go to click on something and it moves out of the way. Well, one way you can avoid that is making sure you set the width and height of your images in the image tag itself. That way, before the image loads, the browser will allocate the space on the screen for it. The D, L, and DT tags, this is a definition list. Definition lists are some of the most underused HTML elements on the planet. This allows you to create terms with one or more definitions per term. So what I'm doing here is, instead of having a link and then some information below it justified to the right, I'm creating a definition list where we have a term, which is the link, and then two definitions, which are two pieces of information pertaining to the link. Once I get all this in here, it needs to be styled, so right now it's just a couple of copy and paste commands. There we go, it's moved into the column, but it doesn't look the same. So I'm going to come back up here to the CSS, and we can start styling the definitions to have them aligned to the right and have a little bit of margin in between each one. And then we style the terms to have additional margin above, so that they're more closely related to, they're more closely visually connected to the items below than the items above. Alright, now we're on to the next row with 3 columns that each have a header in them. The use of heading 1 and heading 2 is very important for allowing keyboard navigation for users who use screen readers. A person who uses a screen reader may browse your page by pulling up a outline created from heading tags and then jump to the section that they want to read. On a short page like this, it seems kind of trivial. When you get to a Wikipedia article, it's extremely important. It's generally a good idea to do it anyway. It doesn't take a lot of time, and as you can see on this, we can style the H2 tags to look like the bold paragraphs that Bryan had there before. We don't have to make our style decisions based on our content. We can style our content to look however we want it to look. We just have to describe it correctly so that it has meaning to the visitor. This last little section in the second row is just the same as above. We are creating paragraphs. We add the self-closing slash to the BR tag. Since Bryan defined a doc type for HTML5, it only makes perfect sense to turn the BR tags into BR slash. You are supposed to put closing slash in self-closing tags in HTML5. And now we can delete the TR and an empty one. This point here is where I realize that the margins are going to be incorrect if I have a paragraph outside of a row. So what I'm doing here is putting some negative margin on the row to account for the positive margin in the columns. That way we can put a paragraph here and it'll line up with the text in the columns even though the columns have padding. And below there are links to videos, and every single thumbnail is referencing a missing image. So we're just going to use a short regular expression to find all of those image tags and rip them out. They aren't necessary. Now a quick run through getting rid of unnecessary line breaks and fixing self-closing BR tags. Now, if Bryan ever does actually see this, this will probably grate on him a little bit, as I'm using Visual Studio Code, and one of his big pet peeves is Microsoft embracing open source software. Visual Studio Code is a very good piece of code. But yes, it is open source software from Microsoft, and that probably grinds some people the wrong way, I assume. I got rid of the center alignment on these links because it just didn't look correct with the thumbnails missing. This isn't me trying to say that Bryan was wrong in his style choice, just that it needed to be adjusted for the missing images. Okay, now we are done with the entire table. We're just going to add a footer here. Bryan does not have a footer on his site, but it's good to have a footer if you can. So I just left a comment there for things that typically go in footers. Now that it's saved, we can do our final check, and it looks mostly the same. There are some differences in line spacing. But more or less we've kept the design of the site. I did not want to force any huge changes on this thing. My goal was to make it more accessible and more semantic. Now it's time to see how well it performs on mobile, and of course it's not perfect. The biggest benefit we get by having non-semantic elements to define rows and columns is that because there's no inherent meaning, because we had to create the rowness and columnness of those items, there is no definition of them being rows and columns for a mobile device. So right off the bat, we've linearized the page for mobile devices. So I tweak a little bit of font sizes. We're going to test it in iPhone resolution specifically and adjust some spacing, but more or less this page is now responsive. So I hope you got something out of this quick little demonstration of how to take an older page in an older style and redo it in a more modern code style, and to make it more responsive and more accessible.